welcome everybody. This is the fourth of our 5-module series on institutional responsibility to realise SDG 6 and the human rights to water and sanitation. I'm Amanda Lufin from Human Rights to Water, and we've partnered with the Water Research Commission in South Africa and the International Water Research Association to create this masterclass involving experts from each of our organisations to present the materials. Each one is an hour of public lecture, which you've just joined, followed by a closed workshop to explore the ideas in more depth. You're welcome to join that, but you need to register through one of our organisations to do that. So the subject matter follows a human rights-based approach. Actually, we've got the 5 topics, starting with an introduction to the human rights-based approach, then moving on to the human rights to water and sanitation and corporate due diligence. Then we're walking through the steps that you might need to take to make that happen, such as a situation analysis, which was our 3rd module. Today we're dealing with stakeholder engagement and looking beyond corporate social responsibility, and it's being presented by Yuri Ramkissoon from the South African Human Rights Commission and Michelle Hiesterman, who is presenting on behalf of the Water Research Commission. So that would be our 4th one today, and then next week we finish up with a module on setting human rights indicators as a tool for realising SDG 6. So the whole event is designed to give you a bit of a feel for how you introduce a human rights-based approach in your business and operations. So before I don't want to talk any longer, I would like to introduce you to Yuri and Michelle, who are going to walk you through today's lecture. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. It's afternoon in Pretoria in South Africa. It's great to be with you all today. We're going to start off with the stakeholder engagement section. So this is a very interesting masterclass, and I previously and only most recently have moved into my current position, which is with the Presidential Climate Commission. But a couple of months ago, when we prepared for this masterclass, I was still with the Water Research Commission. And the content of the section that I will be presenting today is largely out of a piece of work that was done by the Water Research Commission in collaboration with various entities funded by the Global Environment Facility in a project that was implemented in South Africa by the South African National Biodiversity Institute and the Development Bank of South Africa. And the project was developed, and the course that was developed, which I'll introduce, was done by WRC, the Water Research Commission, and Rhodes University. The course was called Gabisa in Dialogue for Water, and that's looking at valuing nature for water. And so a lot of the content that I will share with you is from that today. So I just wanted to recognize that body of work and appreciate it and those who made it happen. So, as I mentioned, I am Michelle Hiesterman, and I'm now based within the Presidential Climate Commission. And much of what we're learning in stakeholder engagement is absolutely crucial in the work of a human rights-based approach to both water, but also climate change. So before we start, I'd just like to check in, because when we are engaging with stakeholders and when we are in a social situation, there is a connection between the mind, emotions, the body, and it's very important for us to feel grounded and to feel centered so that we can engage properly. So I just wanted you to all take a moment to sit upright with your feet firmly on the ground. You can place your hands up or down. You can close your eyes if you want to. And I just want you to observe how you're feeling as you come into this session online. And I think this is very important, especially with online sessions, because we sometimes have this disconnect. So I want you to take note of how you're feeling, what is going through your body, different parts of your body, do a scan from the top through to the bottom and take a deep breath in, hold it, and out through your nose. One more, and out. Continue for 2 more cycles, and out. Okay, so you can slowly bring your awareness back into the room. And I think it's important when you are engaging with stakeholders for you to take a moment for them to check in with themselves, and check in with the room and with how they're feeling. All right, thank you for bearing with me during that. All right, so I want to give you an introduction to stakeholder mapping. Much of the content of this is part of a WRC module, which is available. And so when it comes to stakeholder engagement, it is very important to understand who you're going to be working with and how they relate to each other. What would their interest or mandate be when they're coming into an engagement with you? What does their job entail? What is the role of the institution that they work for? And I think it's also important as we start to bridge working in silos, working in different disciplines, you know, there are boundaries that have to be crossed. And unless we understand who these stakeholders are and where they come from, it can lead to some conflict of perceptions or perspectives. And these are all very good. They're ripe for learning. You know, we don't want everyone to think the same way, but it's very good to be aware of how other people are feeling and thinking as they come into a situation, so that we can identify constraints and also opportunities that weren't previously apparent to us. So I'm going to kickstart with a section on stakeholder mapping. This section is really some experiences that have been learned by myself and other people I've worked with in this domain. And there are so many different approaches out there in terms of stakeholder mapping. I provided a link on the slide that also gives you some extra resources to be able to look at, for example, net mapping approaches, and I'll share some other approaches. And I'm not going to go specifically into net mapping, except in a more basic exercise in the workshop, but just to mention those. Firstly, when it comes to stakeholder mapping, it's really important for you to think about the clear question that you are wanting to ask. Why are you wanting to make this map? Why are you wanting to do this work? And for what that reason, why are you wanting to do this map? And this is very important because different techniques and different software or different approaches will work for different questions. If you are just wanting to show different stakeholders and, for example, what sector they're from or what type of organization, that would require different software to whether you're actually wanting to visualize the relationships between the stakeholders. And within that, there can be a whole level of detail that you can start to look at, whether it's power mapping or whatever that may be. One tool and software which is free to access is Kumu. And in the project that I was part of at Water Research Commission, we started to use this tool to draw quite basic stakeholder maps. So again, if you're wanting to understand who the stakeholders are, sorry, and possibly the connections between them, in a very simple way, you can use this. And I'll show you just now how you can log in and register to be able to use Kumu. Just hold on a second. Apologies, I need some water. Another great tool that can be used is, sorry, just to go back. This is what a Kumu map looks like. You cannot see the detail. It looks like a spider web at the moment, but you can start to picture all the different stakeholders in a region and how they could look. A more sophisticated or detailed desktop app that is also available and is free online is called Gephi. And Gephi has preloaded algorithms so that you can look at the process of mapping, and it's automated. So you can start to design a map according to various different categories. So I think Gephi, if you are a researcher in a certain situation, Gephi gives you quite an interesting dynamic, quite an interesting piece of information that I think is dealing more with the complexity of the situations that we are often working into. Our landscapes and contexts are extremely complex. And so at some stage, it is very useful to start to have that more detailed analysis. Apologies. And so you can get to a deeper level of understanding causation and begin to work with the software. Here's an example of what a Gephi map would look like. And the Excel spreadsheets that are developed around this can start to develop quite a bit of deep analysis and understanding. What I like to encourage is that stakeholder mapping can actually be an incredibly powerful interactive tool when you are bringing stakeholders together. You can do this both online, and we've tried this online, but you can also do it in person with very basic materials. And there's a very rich learning that happens when you start to answer these very basic questions. So if you develop, and we mentioned earlier, the importance of your framing question, what are you doing the stakeholder map for? You can then start to drill down with your stakeholders, who is involved and how are they linked? And then another layer and another level is to look at how influential are they? And there's very rich reflective discussion that can happen around those three questions. So here's an example from a practitioner who was working in an agricultural context and how they used very different workshopping materials to begin to explore the stakeholder mapping. When you're at the conceptualization stage of a project, it's very useful to do this so that you are bringing people with you from the beginning. You're not taking an initiative to people. It's a collaboratively developed project. And that's why it's so important to contextualize, to understand the context into which you're working with. And stakeholder mapping is extremely powerful to be able to do that. You can begin to see linkages. You'll see the linkages there. And you can begin to color code according to the linkages between different stakeholders and entities for different reasons. You'll see in this example, you're able to see, according to sector, how the different entities are connected. And so what we'll be doing later in the workshop today is to begin to do some stakeholder mapping ourselves online, where we'll begin to explore a context. We'll do an example context of the KwaZulu-Natal floods in South Africa. And then we'll get you to start to think about your own stakeholder map and how that could begin to look and who would be in the room to assist you with doing that. So if you register later on, you're welcome to join us for that. The next section is around realizing meaningful participation. And here we have to really think about, why are we doing this stakeholder engagement work? We work with as I mentioned, quite complex contexts and multidisciplinary contexts. For most of us in water, especially, we're working with communities, we're working with scientists, with government officials, both local, national, provincial. We're working with agricultural specialists, we're working with farmers, and we're even working with schools. So we really need to understand how we can most meaningfully engage these different entities. And it might be a case where we need to begin to look at a more deeper learning process that we need to be facilitating. As we know, change is not a linear process. It's something that can take time, and very strong social learning processes are important to allow for real meaningful change. And I think from a human rights perspective, that's where it's really important to think about why you're doing this stakeholder engagement work. Are you going to tick a box? There's a lot of projects out there that will do public participation, where it's a presentation of a piece of work and a tick of whether someone approves that. But I think if you're really thinking about participation that is meaningful and is working from a human rights-based approach, you really need to think about deeper learning processes and how to really bring people into a discussion or into an engagement as co-constructors and collaborators in an initiative right from the beginning. So one piece of work that I'm sharing that I found quite useful in stakeholder engagement from a course that was developed by Rhodes University is the 4 Ps of stakeholder engagement: purpose, processes, principles, and practicalities. The first one, purpose, is about the goals that you have in mind. Why do you want to work with certain stakeholders? What is motivating you? What is motivating your organization? Sometimes that can be in sync, and sometimes it can be quite different. And the purpose as well would be to understand what would be the purpose for these stakeholders to want to work with you as well. Rhodes University also provided a breakdown of the kind of purposes that might be relevant to the work that you are doing. This could be information generation, learning, knowledge co-production. It could be strengthening decision-making for collaborative management and governance. It could be simply communication and consultation when you're developing policy. It could be an activism role that you're playing and ensuring an just or equitable participation and advocacy. The next second P is processes. How are we going to do the stakeholder engagement, and what kind of processes will we be using to facilitate and to bring people into an engagement with us? There are various different approaches to learning or to engagement that are out there. I tend to work off a social learning perspective, which is about pooling and bringing together various perspectives into a room as we begin to deliberate and then develop a shared perspective. So another thing to understand when it comes to the processes is that you might be wanting to do participatory research. You might have an activism project that you're wanting to do. You might first need to do some sort of a contextual or situational analysis before a project is developed. But there are different processes in which we would start to engage with stakeholders. It can't only be an afterthought in an initiative or a project that you engage stakeholders at the end of a project. And it even starts to get to the evaluation of the project. When does that come in? At the end of a project or at the beginning? And we'll discuss that a little bit later. So in the previous work that I did, we worked off 6 core social learning and knowledge management practices. And these are quite a useful guide in terms of checking in and making sure that you are developing processes within your project or initiative that are allowing people to build networks. Because once that project's gone, how is the change going to continue? It needs to rest within strong networks and strong connections between different stakeholders. Is your project looking at opportunities for learning and sharing between stakeholders and between you and the stakeholders? Is there evaluation and looking at change over time? How is the coordination and convening taking place? How are you facilitating a session? How are you engaging the tensions in the room, the diverse perspectives in the room? Because those are the hooks usually where meaningful change can come from. How are you clarifying context and ideas? different people, stakeholders come into a space with very different contexts, and it's very good it's very important that you take time to clarify that and allow the space for stakeholders to be able to do that and strengthen understanding. There's a bit more of a basic, or I wouldn't say basic, but to put a reflective cycle into a project is quite important. This is just another lens that you could use, looking at, are you making sure there's opportunity for learning? Are you making sure that the stakeholders have an opportunity for self-assessment? Is there some level of evaluation, not only at the end of a project, but throughout? And what is the actual practice, the doing? How are stakeholders being brought into the practice of the project? The third element is principles. So regardless of the processes that we undertake when we engage stakeholders, there are some very key principles. And this is related to ethics, the ethics that you're using. How are you engaging in a respectful way? What is the culture of the stakeholder that you are engaging with? How are you protecting your stakeholders in terms of anonymity? Are you making sure that people are anonymous when you are sharing information? Is there an element of member checking that what you are interpreting and putting into your reports or your write-ups, is this okay and a correct or truthful representation from the perspective of the stakeholder? So the key principles would be respect, reciprocity, transparency, and reflexivity. So I think it's very important that you have these principles in mind and that you build that into your processes as well. It's very important, as I mentioned earlier, to co-develop the work from the beginning, to include stakeholders, and then also to think of sensitivities when it comes to engagement, work sensitivities, cultural sensitivities. And I think when you're developing your stakeholder plan, engagement plan, which I'll introduce at the end of the session, is to really consider that and bring that in as a standard way of practice. The practicalities are really around understanding your role, getting to know the context, the time frames, the physical setups, the location, the levels of trust in a context, who's going to participate in what ways. So you have to be quite practical when you're doing this kind of work. I'm now going to jump into an element of evaluation. I'm sharing a framework here that is not a framework that everyone will use, but I have found it quite useful in the past in understanding and evaluating stakeholder engagement. It's called a value creation framework, and it was developed by Etienne and Beverly Wenger-Trainer. And I'm happy to provide links to further information on this. You can find it online. But it really is important to not only have engagement where you send an evaluation form at the end of an engagement, if you even do that, to find out how was the food at this event, or checking in with them, was this great? And people say great. That would be the first surfboard that you see there, or the second surfboard is called immediate. That is immediate value. That is the experience of an engagement that a stakeholder has had. That's great. It's good to know if the experience was good or bad or how it was. But we really want to get to an element, a level of evaluation where we're trying to find out, what are our stakeholders getting out of this engagement with us? What resources, what insights are they getting? Are they able to take what they're learning and apply it in practice in their workplaces, in their everyday lives? What are they doing with what they're learning or the engagement that they have with us? What you do with it is what stakeholders do with what comes out of that engagement is really important as we start to develop projects that are looking at meaningful change over time. I think that The challenge with many initiatives is that there is a very short-term approach, and we're not getting to an element, a level of starting to see meaningful change over time. And we're not thinking about our stakeholder engagement in a way that starts to change people's way of working and doing. Another important point that I wanted to raise around this, sorry, it's just slipped my mind. It'll come to me later, but just to reiterate that it is important that you begin to monitor and evaluate the engagement that you're having. Something that we will do later in the workshop is start to actually use evaluation from the beginning. So how would you structure an engagement by thinking what stakeholders could get out of an event or could get out of an engagement, and how could they apply what they learn or what they experience in engaging with you? So we'll do that in the workshop a bit later. So the last section that I want to go into before I hand on over to Yuri is really starting to develop a stakeholder engagement plan. So a stakeholder plan is a basic tool to catalyze and organize your stakeholder engagement right from the beginning. And often it's in line with the different funder policies. I've learned mostly from developing a stakeholder engagement plan with the Global Environment Facility previously, but you'll find most large funders or most projects will develop a stakeholder engagement plan. And it's not only because it's a funding requirement that you should be doing this. This should be something you consider right from the get-go. You want to be thinking about, how are you going to engage? Is this going to be small, safe focus group discussions, one-on-one engagements that might be safer? This also links to that principle, or that to practicality as well, location. Are you going to be having larger, broader stakeholder workshops? So different methods of engagement, you can start to brainstorm on that. It's also important in your plan that you have certain institutional arrangements in place so that you can keep check on the stakeholder engagement. How is the plan being adhered to? Often it helps to have a project steering committee for a project, so to really give an idea of a project's governance system, because that would also mean stakeholder engagement. Who is on the steering committee? I think it's useful within a stakeholder plan to give an analysis, a basic. Often early in projects, we're still figuring out who we're going to be working with, but you really should have a large, a broad scale idea of who you'll be engaging with. This and a bit of a summary of the organizations that you'll be working with at a national, provincial, and local level. And you can start to provide a database. So often in your stakeholder engagement plan, and I think what's really important, which I forgot to say, is your stakeholder engagement plan is a living document. It will evolve and adapt as the project's lifespan continues. So you will continuously update your stakeholder database, and even your stakeholder analysis will change. And you want to be working with that as your blueprint for project management. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to know who the stakeholders are, understand their needs and expectations, their priorities and objectives. It's just made me remember the point I wanted to make earlier, is that we have, what I've been experiencing is there's a lot of stakeholder fatigue out there. We often have areas that are challenged, and stakeholders are tired of talk shops, people talking, and no change is happening. So more so than ever, we really need to hear our stakeholders, and we need to make sure that we are taking the necessary steps to make sure that the engagement that we have is meaningful to them and for them. So in terms of, just to go back to their needs and expectations, it's very important, because then you can tailor the engagement for each stakeholder that you have identified. It's also important to identify those that there may be difficulties in engaging with certain groups, and there may be may need to be planning around timing on how to develop and implement trust, how are you going to, or who is going to engage with a certain stakeholder group in a way that would offer you access? And how could you move in the most cautious and most careful way in engaging with groups that it might be more difficult to engage with? And I think very importantly is here, and here comes in an element of gender as well, and of youth, as well as different groups and cultures. We need to think of the most marginalized and vulnerable stakeholders, and we need to consider them in our stakeholder engagement planning. It's important to think about how these stakeholders can be effective and affected, and how the engagement needs to be tailored to inform them so that we can understand their views and concerns in an appropriate manner right from the beginning. Later on, we'll be starting to ask some of these questions in your own change projects. We want to know about your context and see if we can explore this with you in the workshop. Okay, that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to Yuri. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you later.
Thanks so much, Michelle. My name is Yuri Rankisoen. I work for the South African Human Rights Commission. So good afternoon from South Africa. I'm just going to be doing a little bit on corporate social responsibility. So according to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is a management concept where companies integrate social and environmental concerns and often ethical concerns into their business operations and interactions with stakeholders. CSR is generally understood as being the way through which a company achieves a balance, this between their profitable line and economic, environmental, and social imperatives. In this way, they address the expectations of shareholders and stakeholders. And they, of course, want to maintain a profitable business. I referred to the triple bottom line here. This refers to a commitment to measuring a company's social and environmental impact, also sustainability efforts, but also profits. In the past, I think the private sector saw itself as independent from society at large. It was interested in maximizing profits, and the sole goal was that of profits. But over the last 4 decades or so, I would say in the late 70s, the private sector, either through external pressure and in some cases internal reflection, recognized the responsibility that they had towards the environment and their surrounding social circumstances, also human rights and society as a whole. And this led to companies, whether for altruistic reasons or just as a tick box exercise, to adopt CSR schemes. I think it's important to, at this point, to link back to the portion I did in my first masterclass, which was on, sorry, I'm going the wrong way, which was a human rights-based approach argument for business, and noting that, to some extent, rethinking a business position in society as a role player can lead to many benefits for that company, and these benefits are listed here. And I did go over this in the first masterclass for those of you who attended. But these are particularly incentives for the private sector to incorporate a human rights-based approach to their activities, both for companies and society at large. But going back, it's equally important to draw a distinction between CSR for strategic business management and CSR that is charity. And I'll speak a little bit more about that later, but charity in the sense of sponsorships or philanthropy. There are different types of CSR that companies implement, and these generally fall into like 4 or 5 broad categories. So they are generally environmental or sustainability, ethical, social, or human rights. That would be the second category, philanthropic, as I spoke about, and economic. And sometimes social is considered separate from ethical, depending on the company. If we look at environmental in particular, this refers to a company's commitment to sustainability, sustainable development, environmentally friendly activities and operations, and commitments towards the reduction of climate change through various means. Ethical refers to a commitment to operate within a moral imperative and to uphold human rights in the full supply chain of a company. So this will include things like human rights principles, such as non-discrimination, transparency, fair trade, gender mainstreaming, and the elimination of unethical business practices such as child labor and racism. Philanthropy refers to things like outreach or goals for bettering society, and it includes things like bursaries, scholarships, funds, or campaigns for the company. And then finally, there's economic. And economic refers to responsible and progressive business decisions that have positive outcomes, such as investing in funds that share high moral or ethical standards, investing in clean energy or alternative energy sources. These are examples of economic CSR schemes. So these are the broad categories of corporate social responsibility. There are additional categories, but most can be filed under one of the above four. So you'll often hear things like governance, which may fall under ethical, good labor practices, which could also fall under social or ethical, and importantly, accountability. Now, it's important to note that there is a dark side of corporate social responsibility. And there's a difference here. I want to differentiate between CSR and business and human rights. These are often used interchangeably, these two terms, but they are quite different. So corporate social responsibility does not always account for a change in operations of a company, whereas business and human rights, refers to changing the way in which businesses operate to ensure that they're more responsible. So we've seen, particularly in developing countries, businesses operating in countries with poor regulatory frameworks, where they take advantage of those regulatory frameworks and then act with impunity, break the law, or, go over into the gray area where they're not necessarily breaking the law, but acting in unethical ways. All the while still subscribing to corporate social responsibility in various ways. So in 2015, a study done by the Harvard Business School of 142 companies found that 60% of managers said that they were dissatisfied with their company's CSR practices. And it's important to note that this study included companies that had notably advanced CSR practices. So this almost certainly means that these statistics are lower for smaller or less prominent companies and companies operating in the global south or developing countries. Additionally, 48% of companies were engaged in philanthropy, just philanthropy, as opposed to a change in business operations or operational improvements or transformation in their business model. Corporate social responsibility applied to existing business operations doesn't always yield systemic change in societies. These schemes are important because they make valuable contributions to communities and they have the potential to change lives. So, for example, bursaries or scholarships, these do change lives, but they don't always lead to systemic change in a community or a country. Toxic business practices are still undertaken by companies that have very prominent CSR commitments, and even those companies that have adopted the UN guiding principles or belong to the UN Global Compact and other organizations that are committed to responsible and ethical human rights practices. In fact, some of the worst human rights violators do belong to these compacts, such as Shell, Chevron, Exxaro, and we see that they are polluters, the world over and, act with impunity in many developing countries. So we need to be very careful when applauding CSR initiatives without interrogating a company's track record, because without systemic change in the fundamental way in which companies operate, CSR can often be a band-aid on a gaping wound because only systemic changes that include human rights principles, such as access to information, engagement with all stakeholders, transparency, due diligence, and importantly, accountability, which is sorely lacking in many companies around the world. Only that will lead to systemic change in communities and societies. Whereas CSR will only lead to change, for individuals and smaller companies. So when can CSR, be positive for a company? So linking to Michelle's presentation, I think a company first needs to know who their stakeholders are and who they impact. And often larger companies will find that they impact most people in a country and even beyond borders. What is the goal of their CSR? I think companies need to be very clear and very honest with themselves. Is the goal philanthropy? Do they just want something nice for their annual report? Is it to change existing systems, where changes are made almost at a cosmetic level to improve business? Or is it, total transformation of the company to ensure that all operations are ethical, human rights based, and so forth? And then some companies will decide that all three of these are important, but it's important to align these and ensure that they speak to each other. And it's also important to align goals within different sectors in a company. They need to look at best practice, including internationally. So often you get a parent company that operates ethically in their home country, often developed countries, but then act with impunity in developing countries. And they need to take their lead from the parent companies. If they wouldn't do something in, for example, the USA or the UK, why would they do it in a developing country? Coherent CSR strategies, I just spoke about this, they need to make sure that the strategies are coherent across all departments and sectors in their company, and there needs to be buy-in by all. And when buy-in by all, we mean it needs to start with the board, the CEO, the CFO, and so forth, and right down, to every employee within the company. And then I spoke a bit about this just now. Do not take advantage of developing countries or countries with poor regulatory frameworks, countries in post-conflict or current conflict. So don't take advantage of countries when they're in a vulnerable position. Stick to the regulatory frameworks or stick to best practice and operate from a moral high ground. So in that way, CSR can work. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for these great questions. And it's so wonderful to see so many amazing people from all over the world that are part of today. Thank you, Yuri. That was very interesting. We still have, I think it's 15 minutes. So I'm going to have a look at some of the questions. And if I see any especially relevant for you, Yuri, I'm going to call you in. Okay, so some of them I've responded to in the chat already, to you directly, but I also just wanted, there was one question on the evaluation that I had shared earlier, and that is this done over a long period of time after the engagement? So the framework that I use there, you can actually start to ask questions of stakeholders even before you start. So there's a value level that's called orientation. And it's really encouraging the co-production or co-creation of a project with people. So you can do it before, you can engage with stakeholders right as you are finishing up an engagement with them. You can then come back to them in a few months. So it's not linear. It allows for flexibility with when you ask the evaluation questions. And yeah, you can adapt that to suit your needs. Just going through some of the questions. How do we, and this is a good question because I don't think we adequately went through this in detail around transparency. Transparency and engagement is extremely important. And transparency, I guess, in project management is important. And I see elements of corruption brought into the question that I'm busy reading. I think that we have to have systems in place, systems and structures in place in our stakeholder engagement. Hence the importance of a stakeholder engagement plan, evaluation and monitoring of that stakeholder engagement to make sure that we are adhering to the ethics and principles that we set about in the first place. So I think that's important. And, you know, I don't think I went enough into depth on the importance of how do you allow, how do you keep stakeholders safe? How do you make sure that the quietest voices are in the room, that they are not being quietened further? Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of principle and ethics that goes into stakeholder engagement, and I think we've only just scratched the surface. And I think the most important thing about this masterclass is that we begin to open up this conversation, and hear from the experiences of others who've been working in this space.
Michelle, can I come in before you move in?
Please do, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is quite a problem, particularly in, you know, developing countries. And I think this is where, you know, national human rights institutions and other civil society organizations come in. I'm not sure, you know, which country you operate in, but many countries have access to information laws where you make a request for certain documents through your NHRI or through another process, and you know, a company is compelled to share those documents with the public. And then a very active citizenry, you know, community-based activism and community-based monitoring is one of the most effective ways to hold companies to account and ensure that there is transparency, which is in the best interest of the company as well. But, you know, it's not always easy to make them see that. Thanks.
Thanks, Yuri. There's another fascinating question that kind of links to that around, do you have any advice on how NGOs could increase their understanding of how to engage with government or institutions that are often within silos? This is such a good question. And I think that from my perspective, what I like to remember is that institutions, and there may be blockages within that institution or reasons for people not engaging, but I like to remember that government institutions or any institution, private sector, is a group of individuals, and there are people within those institutions who are often trying to do the best that they can. That there are people, and it's about human connection. And I think that sometimes when we approach stakeholder engagement with an element of empathy, we are able to connect with people, and we are showing that we are willing to understand what their needs and concerns are, that we are wanting to work with them in developing solutions in a safe space. And that safe space is critical. We haven't gone into that in enough depth here. It often allows us to break through those silos on an individual level, so one-on-one with people. That's kind of my experience in the past. When I remember when I worked in a catchment project in KwaZulu-Natal, and we were struggling to get the municipality working on this water project. And I remember going to these meetings, and people were shouting at the government officials, and government officials would go, keep quiet, leave. And it was through me connecting with one individual in the municipality at a personal level, asking, you know, just chatting about our kids, that we managed to form a relationship. And suddenly I had this entrance and this trust that I had formed with this individual, and I was able to work with that municipality quite well. So yeah, that's just one perspective. Yuri, I saw you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I did. You know, I think it's important to note, especially for you, Mark, that many countries, government is accountable to the people, and you have a right to approach government departments in a way that you say to them, look, there is no interdepartmental collaboration. Can we, you know, ask for a meeting where we get all officials in a room? And you have civil society organizations and a very strong national human rights institution who can assist with that, to say, look, we need you all in one room, you know, not talking to each other, and this is our goal, and how do we get, you know, how do we achieve that? Because ultimately the state is answerable to the people. I know it doesn't always work in practice, but you have a right to ask and you know, maybe get a point person within government departments who can assist. And Michelle's quite right. Once you develop, you know, a relationship with one person, it opens many doors for you. Thanks.
Thanks, Yuri. There's so many great comments and questions that I haven't had a chance to get to all of them, but we will definitely take time to reply to each of you. I've seen, yeah, I see in India, there's also a challenge around stakeholder fatigue. We'll definitely share all of the information that we've given you today. It will be available so that you can access tools. It also helps to go onto, if you just Google stakeholder engagement plans, I must be honest, there's not, you know, this is a project for someone to really develop a stakeholder engagement plan template. There's so many out there, but I really had to just do some Googling when I developed one for a previous project, and just pick out what other projects had done. But maybe we need to bring a human rights perspective lens to this. Someone asked to see the diagram, the surfboard. So the value creation framework. What I'm going to actually do is reply there and provide the link to you, Mark, on the value creation framework. In fact, I'll put it in the chat for everybody so that you can access the value creation framework anytime online. It is freely available there with some resources. I see a question on farmers. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to agriculture, again, it's much like working with any stakeholder, although I do know it can be very challenging. I think there you got to focus, I find a focus on practice. And if there's one thing farmers I find love to do is to talk about their farming and incredible innovation in agriculture, small scale and commercial. There's incredible innovation, and there are hooks in there if we take the time to understand their challenges as well, but also some of the bringing them into the conversation as co-constructors of the project. What do they actually need? But I mean, it's easier said than done. I understand the blockages that there are. Yeah, there's so many questions here, guys, and I think we only have 5 more minutes. Yuri, were there any other of the questions you wanted to address yourself? Well, I
think there were a few. Why so much emphasis on ethical when it's not compulsory, when it is not transformative? Yeah, I think there has to be emphasis on ethical, and, you know, we need to move towards transformative. You need to start, I think, you know, corporate social responsibility leading to business and human rights is a continuum. It has to start at some point, and then, you know, a company will need to slowly transform. But, and this links to one of the other questions, why would companies do this if they're not compelled to do it? And I think, you know, no, they're not compelled to do it, but many international companies are signing on, you know, to UN principles, UN organizations, international sort of frameworks, and they need to be reminded that when you sign up, you know, onto these frameworks, you make a commitment to communities, and they need to be continuously reminded of this. And no, this is not the law yet, but you know, ultimately we want to reach because the law doesn't always work. You see it with governments. They're obliged by law to do X, Y, and Z, and they don't always do it. So the law is not always the answer, but we need to, you know, ensure that companies understand that communities are monitoring them and will call them out, you know, when they violate the laws. So, you know, that's one effective way of doing this.
I think there was a question on an example of CSR that was launched, which was human rights based. I think we'll be going into that in the workshop for those who are able to attend. If you know of an example.
Yeah, no, we will. You know, I think it's just important to note that what I was trying to say about CSR is that it needs to evolve to something more than just CSR. It needs to transform, the company needs to transform the way in which it operates. And that needs to happen by, I think, communities, civil society organizations, and so forth, holding that company accountable if the state is not already doing so. And we do know that often states are not strong enough to hold companies accountable. Yeah.
Thank you, Yuri.
Yeah, I think, you know, the South African examples, I think we'll have to answer that directly, you know, like Lonman and so forth. We're already dealing with some of these complaints already. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. So we are we're going to take a log of the questions just so that you're all aware of that, and those that were unanswered, and then we will provide answers via the website or the email. So we're going to have a break now for those of us who are going to join in the workshop, and half an hour break. To those of you who won't be joining in the workshop, it was absolutely wonderful to have you participate in today. And we really welcome your questions. As we mentioned, we're going to address those. And yeah, thank you so much. Greetings from South Africa, and I hope you all keep well. Bye.